Hello, and welcome to the seminar on space and media. So the big takeaway from this seminar is that new cultures of the way space and vision are designed usually coalesce and inform one another. And that is to say, if a change happens in the way we organize space, then it usually occurs concurrently with a change that's also happening in the way that we consume media. So they're very kind of interconnected. But to start off, I'm going to cover some broader theories about space and spatial relations. Why study space as a part of media technology? Because it's all around us. It is inescapable. And when we are consuming media, it is always in a space of some kind or another. Watching the same piece of media might lend a different experience depending on whether you're watching it on the bus or in a busy coffee shop or in a communal space in your house or from the comfort of your bed. And these differences depend on the dynamics of those spaces. So Henri Lefebvre argues that space reflects what is happening politically, economically, and socially in culture. And that is to say, space operates ideologically. Space is produced, but it is also a productive process. It produces certain social relationships. So if you take the average lecture theater, for example, which we're not in at the moment, who knows when we'll be in one again. But take the average lecture theater. Lefebvre would argue that it is that this space operates at a couple of different levels. It operates at the level of practical use. It is meant to support a teacher relaying information visually and verbally to a large number of people. The plan and design of the theater are informed by this practice, by this practical use. It usually involves two main aisles leading to a stadium arranged rows of seats with little writing tables, and a podium at the front with a large screen behind it. So there's a practical use, there's a sort of a design element of this space, and then there's also a symbolic meaning in the space. So the design of the space connotes an authority to the person standing at the front. It doesn't connote an authority to someone standing at the back watching what's happening at the front, right? That's not the person in charge. It's the person in front who's in charge. And the design of this space intuits that relationship. It also embeds a feeling of courtship among students because you're all sitting together and you're all facing the same direction, so you're all one sort of student body. This is different from collaborative working rooms at UQ, for example, where you're divided into little groups and you have identities that are kind of, the full room has an identity, but you also have an identity as a small working group. And that depends on the sort of organization and design of the space. All of this is to say that in order to study media in space, you need to study the space itself and how media operates along these kinds of three levels. So in the lecture theater, the main media is a screen at the front, and the lecturer controls what you watch, reinforcing the relations of power that we just described, that there is one sort of source of media and it is controlled by one person at the front. It would be weird if the screen were at the back of the lecture theater or on the ceiling. The social relations of power would be different if you had individual screens and were watching the content there simultaneously. You would have the feeling of courtship, but it wouldn't give me as much power. And the same sort of goes for a collaborative working room where you have multiple screens around the room and you have tables where you're in your sort of pods of students. It actually lends the teacher, it denotes a little bit less authority that is lent to the teacher in that sort of space because it's meant to be sort of collaborative. So space reveals a lot in terms of how we are social and political subjects and how institutions of power construct us as these subjects. So moving on to another idea of space, Michel Foucault famously studied the emergence of a certain kind of space and culture of surveillance and power that emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries in the West. And it inflects the design of our schools, prisons, and asylums, our mental health institutions. In short, institutional architecture. And there is a reason why your schools perhaps bore resemblances to prisons and mental institutions. That is because they were thought up as institutions around the same time, and this coincided with an intended culture of watching and surveilling bad citizens. So this was famously materialized in Bentham's design of the Panopticon, a prison design that situated each prison cell in a circle around a central watchtower that could see into each cell, even though the prisoners never knew whether or not the guard was actually in the tower. So this led to the prisoner internalizing the power dynamic that made power omniscient and vigilant rather than simply punitive. So instead of just beating people up and executing them, the punishment in this prison is the surrender of privacy. And I'm sure you might have encountered Foucault's Panopticon in previous courses from the communications degree. Another example, I'm just giving you a bunch of examples of how space and sort of power relations and media kind of connect. Another example of the commingling of spatial design with visual culture comes from the work of Anne Freeburg, who studies the emergence of the spatial architectures of the department store and the cinema around the late 19th century. So these two things emerge pretty much at the same time, and she's arguing that it's not a coincidence, that they're actually connected in some way through how people were thinking about space and vision. She argues that these new spaces were not only spaces that allowed women to freely navigate public space, but that they encouraged a kind of consumer-driven gaze that also coalesced with women's navigations of urban space more generally. In other words, women were going to the cinema, they were shopping and running around urban space in new ways that allowed them much greater freedom of movement and vision, that they can consume the environments around them in almost a cinematic way. So to move through the city and through the department store as if you were kind of watching a movie. So the design of space occurs hand in hand with the design of new media technologies, in this case, the department store and the cinema. And the way that we design space influences the culture and vision that inform our inventions of media, and the inventions of media arise out of the way that we are experiencing space on a regular basis. So Anne Freeburg might argue that, the department store maybe actually encouraged vision technologies to emerge that led up to the cinema. And the advent of the cinema informs the way that we design sort of department stores and the way that we think about vision. So let's move on to a smaller and more intimate space. We've sort of talked about these big institutional spaces, these sort of corporate spaces, in the case of the department store. Let's move on to the home. So the home always occupied a special space in the rollout of new media technology. And that is because there's always a trepidation around allowing new gadgets into the home, as boundaries have to be patrolled and sort of reinstated when new gadgets enter the home. Because these sort of boundaries between inside and outside are usually seem to be threatened by new technology. So think about the apprehensions of allowing Alexa into the home. Like, this was kind of based on ideas of sort of privacy and how the home sort of is a private space that shouldn't sort of accommodate this new technology, which is seen to be sort of threatening of people's privacy. So one example of the integration is the integration of television into the home in the 1950s. So if we're going to understand sort of Alexa and the sort of discussions happening around the integration of that technology, we have to look back to the past and how other technologies have been integrated into the home. So lifestyle magazines and architects in the 1950s took into consideration how to mesh the television set into the living room space, where it was slowly sort of taking the space of the hearth or the family piano, which used to be the central focus point of communal space in the house. So at first there were efforts to make television entirely invisible by hiding it in wooden cabinets that looked very Victorian and sort of conservative. But the more that people got used to television, the more it took its sort of very visible place at this focal point of the living room. And this sort of transition might describe a pattern of how we integrate new media into our lives, whereby first we want it to kind of fit in familiar regimes of aesthetics, of use and space, and then later on, we sort of let the technology take center stage. And we can see this in terms of how new media technologies have been designed to be omniscient, but also invisible in the home. So perhaps thinking about smart home technologies, move from being sort of highly invisible in the home and sort of unobtrusive to people's routines. But maybe in the future, they're going to be slowly sort of occupying more visible spaces, places as hubs in the home as people become more and more familiar with them and at ease with them. Going back to the 1950s, architects were beginning to redesign the family home to actually accommodate the television. So television also coincided with new cultures of vision that were already happening. So architects were sort of redesigning the room for television. However, television fit nicely within some architectural movements already happening. So the television was sort of greeted in two ways, in its potential to view a larger outside world, and also the more frightening potential to let the outside world in. And this kind of binary, this double sort of utopic and dystopic idea of television paralleled the design of other movements happening in architecture, like the inclusion of the large picture window in suburban homes, which was very much in style at the time. And the picture window spoke to some of the same apprehensions and hopes, almost as if it were a big television screen, sort of for people to look out into the kind of world. So this transition also accompanied the popularization of the open floor plan that we see in most of our homes today. It designed interior space so that the kitchen would flow into the dining room, would flow into the living room, and so on, and would flow into a big picture window that makes us feel like there's the flow between the interior space and outside space, so it would flow into the garden. So everything was kind of meant to flow all the way through interior spaces and to the outside. And this was partially the invention of Frank Lloyd Wright and other architects working in the early 20th century. And this was the open floor plan was a physical and visual aesthetic that intuited different ideas of sociality and family, that the family can spend time together in the same space, even though they might be occupying different sectors within that space. So, you might be in the same sort of space in your house with your family, but you might be on the sofa kind of consuming something on your smartphone, and your dad might be in the armchair consuming the television, your mom might be elsewhere, your sisters might be, and you're all in the same sort of space, but you're kind of in your own sort of bubble in the same space. So this was set in real contrast to the Victorian home, which very starkly segregated space along gender and age lines, with the children being cornered off in the nursery, which was usually in the upstairs, the wife in the kitchen, which was usually in the back of the home, and the men in the smoking room or drawing room, which was kind of at the front of the home. So the spatiality of the open floor plan in the 1950s house and television's central space within it communicated that television could bring the family together in a sort of bonding way, with members arranged in a semicircle in front of it. And this also has an historical context, right, of the post-war era, where women were returning from having factory jobs during the wartime to going back home and not having jobs and being mainly homemakers. At the same time, men were coming back from the war and were kind of being reintegrated into a family after sort of sustaining huge amounts of psychological trauma. So the television in this context was thought to be a kind of a healing and binding agent for the traditional family. And this was also expressed through how the home was being redesigned to kind of reintegrate family members and to kind of coalesce an idea of the nuclear family. This is to say that new media, whenever they enter a scene, coincide with changes in the design of space that rescript our social relationships. And this synergy makes us think back to Anne Friedberg's arguments about women window shopping in the city, experiencing kind of consumption as if they were watching a film. So another interesting example of the open floor plan and its intersections with media comes in the form of the Playboy bachelor pad, which was popularized in the 1950s and 60s. And contrary to a lot of popular thought about Playboy magazine, it was more than just a dirty mag. It was an extensive lifestyle sort of advice venue to help bachelors gain independence from female help after the war. So there were articles, for example, about how to self-style your home, how to fashion yourself without, relying on a wife, how to make a sandwich, thus enabling the Playboy to play. The Playboy pad celebrated the open floor plan design, which instead of becoming a family suturing device, served as a mechanism of seduction, with the dining room easily leading into the living room, easily leading to the bedroom. The Playboy apartment usually sported an array of automated and media-centered features, like beds that emerged out of sofas and beds that rotated, lights that were dimmed with the touch of a finger to a remote control, record players that would suddenly play romantic music, wet bars that would pivot out of walls. The Playboy of the 1960s thought of media's relationship to space in a different way. By using the same vocabulary of the open floor plan and its media possibilities, the Playboy used these relationships as a facilitator of sex rather than the union of family members. So this is also a kind of an example of how transitions in architecture can kind of have different uses with the integration of media. So let's pause here and answer a seminar question. So I would encourage you to think of a space that you occupy every day. Mentally take a survey of the media in that space and ask, what kind of relationships exist between the media and the space in terms of its uses and experiences? What social agenda does this relationship have? So the way that media and space connects, what kind of person does it want you to be? Or what kind of things does it want you to do through that relationship?